This is the book Winchee, Mission Stories of Colin and Melva Winch by S Ross Goldstone. The true adventures of missionary pilots and nurses in the South Pacific, as retold to the children of Watertown SDA Church. I'm your storyteller, Austin Bacchus. Let's go!
The first chapter today is called Flying Fish and Wandering Feet. Pastor Ron Vince had come from the division headquarters in Wahroonga at the time that Colin was doing a flight from Wewak to Pagi on the West Irian border. So Colin invited Ron to join him on the flight. Colin was transporting boxes of Bibles and book supplies to the national workers who had been located there to open up the work in that area. Bags of rice and cartons of tinned fish would help keep these workers going until they established their gardens in the villages to which they had been appointed. It was a lovely morning for flying up the northwest coast of Papua New Guinea before heading inland for Pagi. Both men were enjoying the flying conditions as they chatted. Colin explained to Ron how easy it was to fly the plane. He then offered the controls to Ron, explaining the uses of the different control mechanisms. With these explanations, he gave demonstrations of each of the controls. Ron was delighted to accept the offer, and for a time he flew along quite acceptably. Then something must have startled him because all of a sudden he pushed hard on the control column. The airplane nose dropped, and for an instant the plane was weightless, and a carton of tinned fish in the back cargo compartment rose in the air and hovered until Colin resumed control of the plane, who then crashed back down on the bags of rice. While the load had been secured, it had obviously not been secured sufficiently, and they had produced another type of flying fish. On another occasion, Colin was flying out of Wewak's Wiriu airstrip with an American church worker who showed intense interest in photographing all that he could see. It was also new and different. Anticipating a problem, Colin took time to explain the confined space within the cockpit of the small aeroplane, and therefore the close proximity to the vital instruments. The visitor was seated in the right-hand front seat. Colin warned him to be careful, not to touch the rudder pedals or the control column if he moved around to take pictures. After a prayer for the Lord's protection, Colin taxied to the end of the runway, preparing for takeoff. He notified traffic control of the flight details and gunned the engine, gathering speed down the runway. The nose of the airplane had already lifted, and the pilot was about to lift the rear wheels when suddenly, without warning, the plane veered sharply to the left, heading for a road that ran parallel to the runway. Glancing down at the rudder pedals, Colin noted that his passenger had his left foot pushing hard on the left pedal. The passenger had seen something flashing past that he wanted to photograph, so swiveling in his seat, he shot out his leg to stabilize himself, not realizing he had smashed his foot down onto the left rudder pedal. Well, there was no time for niceties. They were about to crash. Colin gave the American a thump on his left leg to alert him to what he had done, and fought with the controls to avoid the impending crash. Just in the nick of time, Colin regained control of the plane and brought it back to the center line of the runway. It was a very quiet, humble passenger who sat still in his seat for the rest of his flight. The next chapter is called Search and Rescue Missions. On many occasions, mission planes were called out by the Department of Civil Aviation to assist in searching for missing, presumed crashed aircraft. Most years in Papua New Guinea and on rare occasions in the Solomon Islands, an airplane would go missing, and all the charter operators and mission pilots with available planes would be called out to search for the downed pilot and passengers. Usually these incidents would occur in bad weather, and mostly along the mountainous spine of New Guinea, which rises up to 15,000 feet. Sometimes pilots were caught in clouds and would try to climb out, only to get snagged on some limestone ridge. There were instances where pilots lost their radio, and without being able to communicate to base, they landed at some isolated strip, thus triggering an organized search. The Department of Civil Aviation would initiate certain phases. If a pilot didn't call in at the time nominated for his position or landing report, an uncertainty phase would be raised. After half an hour, if there was no response from the pilot to the many pilots trying to call him, a more urgent phase would be initiated. On the other hand, if a pilot had called in notifying of an engine failure, a distress phase would immediately be set in motion. Under such circumstances, the plane in distress would sometimes crash in the huge canopy of tropical jungle and settle down below the closed-over canopy, making it very difficult to see the crash from the air. Two types of aerial search followed. The Department of Civil Aviation would allocate given areas to each search pilot, together with his spotters. Initially, it would involve a relatively elevated grid search. Grid lines would be followed accurately on the map, back and forward, flying north to south and east to west, covering an allocated area. For both pilot and spotters, this was a tiring process. Keeping one's eyes fixed on rugged mountains or dense foliage while looking for any glint of sunshine on metal, white twisted wreckage, or broken branches as evidence of a crashed aircraft, this was all a strain on the senses. Then there was contour searching. This was more dangerous for a pilot and spotters, having been given a base altitude and a peak altitude, and they were to search between those two altitudes. Starting at the highest designated altitude, the pilot would fly along the contour of the mountains, sometimes right into tight valleys. He needed to be very alert as he flew the airplane at just barely above stalling speed, constantly aware that at any moment he might have to go full throttle to pull out of a potentially dangerous situation. Having completed one run, he would turn the opposite direction, giving the spotters on the other side of the plane the opportunity to use their rested eyes once more. Should nothing be spotted, the pilot would drop a couple hundred feet down the mountainside and repeat the process until the whole designated area was covered. Of course, each pilot had also to be alert that he didn't fly into the path of another search plane covering an adjacent area. These searches would often go for hour after hour, sometimes requiring the pilot to land the plane for refueling, during which food and hot drink would be consumed before returning to the air once more. A tremendous effort was always made to find the downed aviator and his passengers. Sometimes days of searching took place before the lost was found, and most often the downed pilot and passengers were killed in the crash, and it would then become a case of retrieving the bodies. But not all search and rescue operations took place over land. There were times also when mission planes were asked to search for a lost or disabled ship. Gordon Lee and Colin had been holding district meetings at Beaulieu and Musau Island, while the J.L. Tucker had been parked on a wartime airstrip at Emerau. On arrival back on the morning of April 19, 1971, they were notified that an inter-island trading vessel, the Musira, was missing at sea somewhere north of Emerau, having lost power and also lost radio contact. The Malalagi had already set out to sea to endeavor to locate the stricken vessel, but the Papua New Guinea Search and Rescue authorities requested Colin to make an aerial search. Colin was familiar with the Musira, as during his residency at Beaulieu, the captain had kindly brought much longed-for mail and groceries to the isolated family. They searched for some time without success, and running short of fuel, they were forced to return to Kavieng to replenish the tanks. Again, they took off, with Melva Winch, Gordon Lee, and John Kosmeyer being the spotters, while Colin concentrated on flying. Eventually, they located the missing vessel drifting far to the northwest, some 65 nautical miles from Kavieng. There was little or no hope of the boat reaching land on its own, even though they caught a glimpse of Tench Island in the distance. Some of the crew could be seen swimming in the water, vainly endeavoring to pull the heavy vessel to the island with ropes. It was a losing battle. Unable to make radio contact, Colin flew low over the Musira as Gordon Lee wrote a message on John Kosmeyer's rubber flip-flop, notifying the crew that the Malalagi was searching for them and that the plane would lead it to them. They would be towed to safety. The flip-flop was thrown out of the plane and landed alongside the Musira. It was recovered from the sea, the message read and acknowledged. Colin then flew to the Malalagi, where they dropped the other flip-flop, giving the location of the stricken vessel and instructions to follow the direction the plane flew in order to meet up with the Musira, and so continue the journey to reach the stricken vessel. For 5 hours, the J.L. Tucker flew between the two vessels until the Musira was taken in tow back to Kavieng. Total flying time in the rescue effort was 7 hours and 10 minutes. This rescue won accolades from the Chinese owners of the Musira, as well as from the government. Thereafter, generous donations were given to Gordon Lee as he called on the boat owners each year on the annual mission appeal, and freight was carried free of charge to the mission stations by the Musira.
Be sure to tune in next time for more stories from the book Winchee by S Ross Goldstone, which is available at the Adventist Book Center. And meanwhile, check out these videos and others on my channel, with many more mission stories and Bible skits for kids and adults. God bless you.